Hi, guys. Good afternoon, and welcome again to today's edition of The Law and You. I am your host, yours truly, Shellon Washington, attorney licensed in the state of New York, in my home country, Guyana, in Trinidad and Tobago. Today, I'm bringing you a special edition regarding annulment instead of divorce. I know some people from time to time would like to explore the issue of annulment, and you might be wondering when are some of the times you can annul rather than divorce a person. Annulment has its advantages in that if you should choose to annul a marriage, it takes it back as if it never happened. And that may be the best option in certain situations, which I will explain during this edition. A lot of times, that's the most appropriate option. As you know, people enter into marriages for various reasons. Some are valid, and some the law says because the parties didn't enter into the marriage on good grounds, the court permits for an annulment. Now, when would a marriage be annulled, or what are some of the factors that contributes to an annulment? Number one, if a marriage was entered into based on fraud, fraud is a very good ground for annulment. Now, fraud is very difficult to establish. So I would tell people that sometimes fraud is not the best, even though there might be evidence of it, because the bar is so high to get over when it comes to fraud. And fraud has to be proven on clear and convincing evidence. Not only does it have to be on clear and convincing evidence, there's a mental element that goes with it that must also be established. And because it's difficult to establish from certain evidence that a person at the time when they entered the marriage, they only intended to defraud you and they never meant to be in a relationship with you, sometimes it's difficult and sometimes it's easy. One of the reasons or one of the grounds on which it's easy to annul a marriage is where there's evidence, obvious evidence of fraud. So, for instance, you'll see people enter into a marriage for immigration purposes. People enter into marriage for various purposes, which, are not good reasons. I've seen a client ask me to annul his marriage because he believed the wife had entered into it based on fraud. But the fact is, when I try to get evidence of the fraud, even circumstantial evidence of the fraud, he really couldn't provide or present any to me except for the fact that there's here and there issues of people saying the person had somebody else, they were still engaged in a relationship with another person, which is good. You can use that to show that, okay, here, while this person was in a relationship with me, they were also simultaneously in a relationship with somebody else. But in order to solidify that fraud, lack of consummation of the marriage is another way that you could concrete that those allegations of fraud. Or you can show that you never lived together with that person. That will solidify your evidence of fraud. And you could say, well, even though we got married, they never lived in the same house with me at all material times. They were living somewhere else. And they never showed any affection towards me. They never supported me in anything that I do. And the record would show that. So, for instance, on your birthdays, they never spent any money on you. They never bought you and bought you anything or show any, acknowledge your presence in their life. They never appreciated you. They never went with you anywhere with your friends, your family. No one have ever seen this ghostly spouse you spoke about. And those are some of the factors that you can use to argue that this marriage was based on fraud, because you look at the circumstances and it's clear on the facts that this person never really was in a relationship or a full proper relationship with you. So fraud is one of the grounds. Another ground would be failure to consummate the relationship. So if one of the party failed to consummate the relationship, that's another ground. The law says you'll be able to annul that marriage based on failure to consummate. And this could happen where one of the spouse has erectile, the man might have erectile dysfunction. Most likely in a relationship where the marriage was never consummated, it's most likely than not that the man had erectile dysfunction or he was impotent. And a lot of times people have underlying illnesses that causes them to be impotent or to suffer from erectile dysfunction, and this contributes to their inability to consummate the marriage. The law says if that person cannot consummate that marriage, or both parties are unable to consummate the marriage, you're entitled to annul that marriage. That's a second ground. And then we have yet another other grounds that we're going to be discussing as we go along during this program. I want to remind you guys that this is the law and you. I encourage you to share the lives. I encourage you to click on the like button and share the program so that other people who might need this information will be able to see it. It will reach the right people. I provide free consultation. So if any of you hear this program and need any assistance in terms of wanting to figure out whether you should divorce or annul or whatever other legal issue is that you see my firm focus on, you can call the office. The phone number is there on the screen, 718-877-3100, Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. The office is open. Back to this issue of annulment, guys. When is a good time to annul versus divorce? I've already given you two reasons: fraud, then lack of consummation. The parties never consummate the marriage. Yet another ground would be an illness. So, for instance, if you marry somebody who had a mental disease that would prevent them from having the ability to consent to enter into the marriage, that's also a ground. A lack of consent could come from the party having, they're mentally disturbed. They have some sort of mental disease that affects their ability to consent. So a lot of those people with schizophrenia, they would at some point lack the capacity to consent to enter into a marriage with you. There is a case where a person got involved and married the woman, and then he wanted to annul the marriage, but because the mental disease occurred before he actually married her, the court did not grant that application. So in this case, you have to have, or that person have to be suffering from the mental disease even before they enter into the marriage. And if there's clear evidence that they're suffering from a mental illness, then that's perfect. Another situation where this is possible, we know a lot of people suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. That's another ground. A lot of people in the United States of America has PTSD. And at some point, if that PTSD was affecting that person, you could argue, it's arguable, but a plaintiff's attorney can argue in an annulment procedure that because that person had that disease that affected them mentally, they were constantly depressed and constantly unable at the time of the marriage of consenting to enter into that marriage. So disease of the mind is one of the reasons why a person would lack the capacity to consent to enter into a marriage. Another one is jest. You enter into the marriage in jest. There's a famous case in the books, in legal books, that tells you that there's this couple and they jokingly agreed that they were going to get married. Neither of them wanted to do it, but they did it out of jest. And the court said, okay, in that case, you're entitled to an annulment. Let me give you another example of a case where the parties wouldn't have there was no intent to create a legal binding marriage. In a case where, let's say there's a husband and there's a wife, or a man and a woman. There's no husband and wife when you're speaking in terms of annulment. Let's say there's a man and a woman, and the two of them are both in a relationship with somebody else. Or let's say the man is in a relationship with somebody else and he needs something from the woman. And maybe he's trying, I've seen this in real life too. Maybe he's trying to get something. He's trying to obtain benefits. There are some benefits in this country that works best when people are married. So some people try to obtain benefits from being married. And in the case, the man was trying to obtain certain benefits and he agreed to enter into the marriage with the mother of his children, who, by the way, they were married before and then they divorced. And the second time around, they never intended to get into a marriage. There was no intent whatsoever, especially on the part of the man. The man had one aim and one aim only, and by all means necessary, he threatened the woman, he forced her, and then eventually she gave in, and they decided to go marry. But during the entire time, there was never any intent of neither party to enter into a legally binding relationship. So they went to the clerk's office. They went and they got married before a judge, and then later, years later, the woman decided to, and the man decided he wanted to go, and the woman decided she wanted to annul the marriage. The woman went ahead and filed the annulment while the man filed the divorce. The court, of course, give way to the annulment because all of the facts supported the annulment. The parties never intended to get married. The husband, the man, the entire time he was in that relationship with that woman, he had another woman that he was actually in a romantic relation with. So he never actually consummated the marriage with him and his wife. He argued that he had some sort of issue in the bedroom and he refused to consummate his marriage with his wife. So therefore, the court permitted the annulment to go through, and that woman was able to move forward with her life based on the annulment. So the second marriage operated as if it never ever happened. So there are some factual cases that actually falls squarely within the realms of annulment, and it warrants it so rightfully. There's a lot of times people enter into marriage with bad faith. They don't intend. I've seen this so many times in immigration cases also, where people trick people into entering into relationships with them. I've seen one where somebody that I know very well entered into a relationship with a man, and the man just really wanted a green card. So as soon, obviously, as he got the green card, he was gone. But I guess she wasn't aware at the time that she could have just done an annulment and annulled that marriage, because that guy did not ever loved her, and he entered with ill will, with bad intentions, and he never really intended for that to be a legally binding relationship. So you must know that if somebody enter into something with bad faith, no intent of making it binding, then that's a problem, because it means that the relationship is going to end anyway, in a manner where either parties never intended. So it's nothing that was beneficial to either parties. A marriage is really a contractual relationship, a financial contractual relationship between two people. And one of the ways that you help to establish that you are deserving of an annulment is where you can show there was no commingling of assets. The party never contributed towards the relationship, so that one party, I discussed this in the sense of marriage, and it's also valid in the sense of annulment also, where you can establish to the court that the other party never really contributed towards the household, never put anything, never paid a bill, not a bill is in that party's name. And if any bill is in that party name, is so negligible, it could only indicate to the court that that party was doing that just because they intended to live there as a tenant and pay a rent. So a lot of times it's so easy but people are not aware that you could actually annul a marriage that was not entered into in good faith, and the party that you actually entered into the relationship with knew this very well and so intended that it should not be binding or have any legal effect. It could have been jest. They entered into jest. There's another ground. There's duress. Remember, in the first factual circumstances that I give you, I said the man forced the woman. He coerced the woman into marrying him. In that case, where a man deliberately coerces somebody into marrying him because he have bad intentions, the court says they're going to grant that annulment. So duress would be, you tell somebody, like, if you don't do this, then I'm going to report you, or I'm going to do X, or I'm going to do Y. Or in the case of the situation I mentioned earlier, like, for instance, if somebody needs something from somebody, for instance, let's give you a factual scenario here. Let's say you go to somebody, you say, hey, can I borrow $10,000? And the person said, well, I can't give you $10,000, but if you marry me, I will give you that $10,000. And you said, well, no, I don't intend to marry you. I don't want to get married. But the person said, well, you know what? If you don't marry me, I'm going to tell the cops you stole money from me, you broke into my house, and you did a whole bunch of stuff that that is not true. That is coercion. The person is now coercing you into getting into a relation, into a marriage that you clearly don't want to get into. And in that case, where a man coerces you, or a woman coerces you, the law says you're entitled to get that annulment. To be honest, I think the annulment is very beneficial in certain instances, and nobody should try to oppose an annulment. The only time an annulment should be opposed is if you know that you got into the marriage with good intent, and you really intended to make that person your partner, your life partner, but it just clearly didn't work out because of difference in culture, difference in views, point of views. You couldn't agree with each other. But in a case where clearly on the face of it, that person did not intend to be in a relationship with you. They didn't had any good intent, and it was just for the purpose of obtaining whatever they're trying to accomplish from that marriage, then clearly you should not allow the marriage to proceed without approaching the court and letting the court know that you would like to annul it. And the beauty of the annulment, like I said, is it takes it back as if the marriage never ever happened before. So then you get the annulment and you go your way, because that's the most appropriate thing to do. Another ground would be polygamy. But polygamy only operates like in certain country where polygamy is banned. Because obviously, if the polygamy is in a country where it's allowed, then there's no annulment on that ground, right? But in the United States, where polygamous marriages are not allowed, you cannot enter into two marriages simultaneously. And in that case, to be honest, you don't even need an annulment for a void marriage, because the marriage is void anyway. Simply by producing a copy of the person's prior marriage and showing that the person never divorced, they never obtained the judgment of divorce, you'll be able to get that marriage annulled. It's really a void marriage if you enter into a marriage with anybody who's already married. And there are plenty instances of this nature where people from certain countries come to the United States, and they try to obtain the divorce in the United States from their home country, wherever that is. The new marriage would be void. And a lot of people don't know this, unless you obtain a valid divorce in the country that you're coming from. And it's becoming more and more prevalent these days, where people are trying to get a quick fix because they're trying to get a green card. They'll try to obtain a divorce in their home country by contacting somebody and trying to do something behind the scene. And if that happens, if you do obtain a divorce behind the scene without going through the proper course, the proper legal course, which is filing the summons and the complaint, having residency in that country or domicile in that country, and all the other factors that goes into it, then that divorce, that marriage, that divorce that you did in that country is avoidable divorce. It would be voidable. So therefore, anytime you enter into any marriage after obtain a voidable divorce, the marriage itself might be void. Because if you don't obtain a proper divorce decree, then that's a problem. And certain states, they don't accept foreign divorces unless one or both of the parties were actually domiciled in the country from which the divorce was obtained. So I know a lot of people here from certain countries, I don't want to specify, but there's a lot of people coming from certain countries. They tend to try to get the divorce from the country that they're from, even though they're not living in that country. They're not domiciled there. The spouse is not domiciled there. They don't work there. They have nothing to establish that they have a residency or a domicile. But the law uses domicile, not just residency. The place where you're domiciled, that's how you're able to establish jurisdiction to file a divorce in that country. And I see Guyana has a totally different standard of what they consider domicile. They do not look to establish actual connections. As long as I'm from Guyana, even now, I can just rush to Guyana, file a divorce, obtain it in Guyana, and it doesn't matter. Because why? Guyana doesn't require me to establish that I'm domiciled there. So I don't need to show Guyana, okay, here I have a house here I have a bank account, here I pay taxes in Guyana, or none of those things Guyana require. All Guyana require is the mental element that I have an intent, that I go there habitually, and my intent is to remain in Guyana and to be domiciled there, to establish domicile. The United States is completely different. You have got to live in your domicile state. In the state of New York, you've got to live there. If your marriage was performed in New York, then you've got to be resident in New York for at least 1 year prior to filing divorce. If your marriage was outside of New York, then it's a little bit different. But you always have to establish the domicile portion. So a lot of those people who are going and doing these divorces in Guyana, the backdoor divorces, you got to be careful, because then the next marriage you enter into might be just a void marriage waiting for an annulment. And it's so easy to obtain an annulment. Like I said, all you got to do is establish any of those grounds that I've discussed earlier in the show. And I will recap some of those grounds. One of the ground is, I said, obviously it's fraud, right? Fraud. And then you have fraud and coercion usually goes together, fraud, coercion, and duress. So it coerce means it's very similar to duress, where you force somebody, you pressure somebody into doing something that they obviously don't want to do, right? Then you have mental illness. Mental illness is a big thing, because the party who has the mental disease lacks the capacity, the necessary capacity to consent to entering into a valid marriage at the time, right? And the other one is just jest. You get married in jest. You're not serious, so both parties don't have the necessary capacity at the time, because they never intended for the marriage to be legally or binding. They just married in jest. They just decide foolishly. A lot of times people go to not Atlantic City, but to in Las Vegas. A lot of people go to Vegas and they go do these Vegas marriages, and then they realize they go drunk, and they do marriages very easily in Vegas. And then the next day or 2 days after, they realize they have to annul it, because they didn't enter into that marriage with the intent of actually making it into a legally binding relationship, right? The other one which we talk about is sexual incapacity, or one of the party has some disease which prohibits them from engaging in certain things, or it could just be a disease. That's another reason. If somebody just simply has some sort of disease and they lie to you, they never disclose it to you, of course you never intended to get into that marriage, period. Because if you know that party had that disease, most people would not want to marry somebody that is known to be infected by some dangerous disease. So obviously, if somebody knows this, they will not. Or if somebody is terminally ill, like a lot of times people have diseases and they don't tell you. Some people have kidney disease, liver disease, and it's failing, and they go into these relationships and they marry people. Then people discover that they married a liability. Now you're forced to take care of that person because they deteriorate very quickly, and now you have to take care of them for the rest of your life. You're stuck. Well, you could probably try to go and annul that marriage on the basis that that person has some sort of disease that it makes it difficult. They enter into the marriage in fraud. They never told you. And one of the fraud that you can use also is a person cannot have children. If a person lied to you about children, sometimes people get into marriage and they never told you that they have a vasectomy. This is mostly for the men. We do know that women, sometimes they do stuff also to prevent them from having children. But sometimes people lie to you, and this is fraud. So note that this is part of fraud. Some people get into a marriage and they have no intention of having children, and they know this very well. How do they know this? Because they had a vasectomy, or they had their tubes tied. So they can never, ever have any more children as long as they live. And they don't say it to you, but they make you get into a marriage. They never disclose this to you. They tell you, okay, yes, I believe in family. I want to have a family. And you get married to that person. And then you discover down the line that, this is bad, because now you can't have children. And the law says that's a ground to annul the marriage. It's fraud. So you wouldn't have to worry. You will be able to move forward and annul that marriage on the basis that that person committed fraud against you. They failed to disclose to you that they had this disease, or I'm sorry, that they're not able to have children, and they knew prior to marrying you. It's not a situation where they discovered after. And I know there's a case like that. I know, particularly the woman had an issue with conceiving, and she knew this before she married the guy, and she never told him. So they got married, and for years he wanted children, and she never really disclosed to him until later down. Then is when he found out that she knew before she married him that she couldn't have children. That would have been a prime case for an annulment. But I guess because the guy spent so many years with the woman, he decided to go and obtain a divorce when the time was right. The parties divorced each other and went their way. But that's a prime case for an annulment. Guys, the annulment, like I said, is advantageous. So if you ever find yourself in a situation like that, with any of those grounds, mental illness, sexual incapacity, fraud, um, polygamy, um, any of the grounds that could possibly be used, inability to consummate a marriage, any of those grounds, if you find yourself in a relationship and you could prove, you know that you can prove and establish any of those grounds, it's just on a preponderance of evidence. So just know that the standard is very low. It's not that high. It's just that fraud is a little bit tricky, and you have to prove the fraud on clear and convincing evidence. So the fraud sometimes, it's a difficult hurdle to overcome. So guys, again, I hope any of those grounds, if you were listening and you believe that you would be able to establish any of those grounds, and you're currently in a relationship and you're thinking you want to annul it, then guys, I encourage you to give me a call. The office is located on 455 Utica Avenue in Brooklyn, New York. And the phone number is 718-877-3100. You can call anytime, Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. We're available to take your calls and answer any of your questions, your legal questions, or maybe provide you guidance on what is best for you. But please note, guys, with all this information I've provided, it's not necessary that every single case might qualify for an annulment. So the facts has to be on a clear and convincing level. So the court must be convinced with what you're telling them that this is true. And once it's truthful, the court could verify it's truthful. You will be able to annul that marriage. And like I said, some marriages are prime example of why and should be annulled, especially in a case where people are in a relationship for many years and then one party disclosed that, hey, I never really loved you. I just got into this for a particular reason. If a man or a woman ever tells you like, hey, I only got into this relationship because I needed you to give me an asset. I needed to get an asset back from you, or I needed something from you, then you know that clearly there was never any capacity on the part of the party I was trying to gain something from you. And that's a lot of situations. And just remember, guys, anytime you see a case where a man is trying to take something from a woman, society tends to frown on that because a man is supposed to work. In the case of a woman trying to take something that she's not entitled to, that's equally wrong, because if you didn't contribute towards somebody's life, leave that person alone and go your way in peace. Take the annulment and move on, because that might be best for both parties. Thank you once again, guys, for joining today's edition of The Law and You. And I will see you back again next week, guys. Do have an enjoyable rest of your weekend, and I will see you again next Saturday at 4 p.m.